Okay, so I'd like to begin welcoming you to this event this evening. We have today Frank Graves, who, as you can see, will be speaking about trust, polarization, and disinformation. We'll be talking about some of his research on what the pandemic is revealing. And just to tell you a little bit about our alumni events that we've been hosting in the department over the course of the past year. This is our third event in the series. We had a number of events. The first one was oriented around speaking with some of our recent graduates who had completed their undergraduate degree in sociology or anthropology. And that one was more oriented around thinking about potential job opportunities following graduation. Then we had another alumni event where we spoke about with some recent graduates from our PhD or MA program and how to get jobs within the federal public service. And this event will most likely be an annual event within our department. We'll have esteemed colleagues who have graduated from our department. In some cases, many, many years ago, in the case of Franco, I think graduated in 1977 with an MA in Sociology. So he's been with us for quite a long time, and he is now an adjunct in our department. So we're very pleased to welcome Frank, into our department, into our alumni event, because he's obviously developed a very strong career following his graduation. So just to tell you a little bit about Frank Graves, he is one of Canada's leading public opinion, social policy, and public policy experts, as being one of its leading applied social researchers. Under the leadership of Mr. Graves, ECOS has earned a reputation for creative and rigorous research in the areas of public policy, social policy, and program evaluation, and a leader in innovative survey techniques and methodology. During his career, he has directed hundreds of large-scale studies of Canadian attitudes on a vast array of issues. Mr. Graves is also a fellow of the Canadian Research Insights Council and honorary fellow at the Calgary School of Public Policy. Mr. Graves also sits on the advisory board of the Sprott School of Business, and he's also an adjunct professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Carleton University. And Mr. Graves also sits on the Vaccine Confidence Advisory Task Force, which I'm sure would have been very busy over the course of the pandemic. So before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that the Department of Sociology and Anthropology is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. And I make this acknowledgement in order to remind ourselves that the Anishinaabe remain the guardians and caretakers of this land, and that those of us who are settlers and are their guests, and hence we have a duty and honor to uphold the land itself and the sovereign Indigenous rights on unceded, unsurrendered Anishinaabe territory. So now I'd like to pass things over to Frank, who will be giving this talk on trust, polarization, and disinformation. So Frank will speak for around 45 minutes. If you have any questions, you can save them towards the end, but you can also, if you have a pressing question that you don't want to forget, you can also put your question in the chat and we will get back to it at the very end of Frank's talk. So Frank, pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here to speak to you today. I'll add to that, because I don't want to see it as a total waste of time, that I also completed all my coursework and comprehensive exams for my PhD. I have the horror of the ABD somewhere, which we don't even know if that is a designation, and maybe we'll fix that up sometime in the twilight of my career. But I certainly enjoyed my training at Carleton. I've had an active relationship with Carleton since, and I'm honored to be involved with the department again. What I'd like to do tonight is to walk through a bit of a story of what's been going on in Canada, with some of which was happening before the pandemic arrived, and some of which, how that was altered as the pandemic hit our shores, there were some interesting differences in Canada compared to other countries, which I'll talk about. And I think just to get to the key point, before the pandemic arrived, we had found, and I had published research showing that Canada was experiencing what we called ordered populism, or in an article in the Calgary Policy Journal, northern populism, which was a point which we documented quite clearly with the empirical evidence and linked it to the theory and why these things occur, why the authoritarian reflex is present in our societies these days. The research was received kind of a mixture of sneering and denial amongst the commentary. A lot of people going, that's what goes on in the United States. They have Trump and so forth. We're really immune from that in Canada. And I can tell you that, not that I feel any pleasure or vindication, but what we've seen going on in Canada, certainly things like the Freedom Convoy, but other factors as well, have shown that really this force is something which is a powerful force, which is reshaping our democracy and our society, frankly, in ways that are probably reasons we should be concerned about. So I will show you how that's evolved, and also show you, I'd like to kind of focus in on the issue of disinformation and how that is exacerbating mistrust and increasing already daunting levels of polarization in the country. So I'm just going to go back a bit, and I've been polling on this almost every day since March of 2020, when the pandemic was first announced. And just to give you a little background, in the first survey, we've done about almost 40 waves of survey using a random probability panel, which I'm glad to answer some questions on because it is unique in Canada. I've asked a broad range of questions to be able to see the evolution, but when we asked people in March of 2020, how long did you think the pandemic would last? The majority said, I think about 6 months. So here we are in our third year, and people are now beginning to think they can see the finish line, although whatever relief that's producing in terms of a reduction in what has been an unprecedented period of anxiety and stress, which has gone on for a longer period than any other moment, any other part of our history that I can recall. It's now, just as there might be getting a bit of a relief on that front, we now are looking at the potential for global warfare, possibly a nuclear engagement in Ukraine and so forth. So it's really been quite a wild ride. But I'd like to kind of show that some of the forces that were in place and which diminished a bit are back, perhaps even more fiercely, and superimposed on the debate, not just about the pandemic, but the more important debate, which will be a contest for the post-pandemic Canada. What will we look like? Will we undergo some type of major transformation? Will we return to the status quo? Only 8% of Canadians think things have returned to normal. And the percentage of those who think that even if we return to some kind of normal, the vast majority of Canadians don't think it's going to look like the old normal. They think we're in for new normal. But there's very profoundly different preferences as to what post-pandemic Canada might look like, depending on which side of this open ordered axis you locate yourself. And I'll talk a bit about that. So let me just show you a couple of, okay, let me see. Yeah, all right. So I'm whipping through things much too quickly. So in our most recent polling, which is only literally days old, we find now that almost 90% of Canadians believe the worst is behind us. That ties the previous high, which was also achieved in the summer of last year, and perhaps should make us mindful that we've had some false dawns and beliefs about the end of the pandemic, which have been frustrated and shown to be exaggerated by the permeability. This vaccine, which is now the Omicron, for example, was the 50th variant that has been classified since the original variant, and so we really, I think, aren't certain that we're getting out of it, but there is a belief that we're at least now going to be able to start seeing some things more normal, and we have seen things a lot more normal than they have been in the past. It's interesting that the outlook on this issues about whether the pandemic is concluding or what impacts the pandemic that is strongly linked to social class. It's linked to other things. It's linked to race. But the social class connections are dramatic. those who identify as working class and poor suffered far more under the pandemic than those who identified as middle class or upper class. They also are far more pessimistic about the future, unlike the upper class and middle class, who largely were capable of working at home and avoiding the threat of confronting the virus daily. They had to go out on public transit and so forth. They were less likely to initially take the vaccine because of a number of factors, which gave them a double whammy because they had poor underlying health conditions. They were therefore more likely to suffer more dramatically poor outcomes. Some of that's dissipated, but there are huge differences in outlook on the future linked to social class. So, for example, the instance of people who think that things will be better in the future rises dramatically as you move from those who identify as poor to those who identify as working class and middle class and upper class. This improvement in outlook is seeing stress levels which had been at a really unhealthy level for 2 years, starting to come down. So the individuals who rate their stress due to the pandemic has dropped to 30%, whereas it's been averaging about 40% for 2 years, which is about double what it would be in a normal period. And I've actually used tools that measure this more formally using clinical tools like something called the Generalized Anxiety Disorder Index, which asks people how often in the past week, for example, they've experienced a physical response like difficulty breathing, or that they've had trouble sleeping, or that they have felt hopelessness, despair, anxiety, and so forth. And we have a brewing mental health crisis, which is already expressing itself, but is probably going to have all kinds of lingering impacts after the pandemic leaves or returns to a normal state or an endemic state. We know that some of the seminal work done by the economist Deaton and Case, for example, who wrote about economics of despair and noted that had replaced all other causes of death, such as traffic accidents, guns. This was American data by those who felt despair about the economic future, and that had been replaced with opioid overdoses, very strongly linked, by the way, to the ordered populism we're talking about and Trump support in the United States. Anyway, let's just go on. I'll just show you what a wild ride it has been. This indicator asks the question, do you think the worst is still to come or it's behind us? And you see these wild oscillations. And we will see, though, that we now see that the numbers have risen to the point where I think most people believe that we're now going to be seeing this in the rearview mirror at some point in the near future. The big debate about whether or not we should remove all the restrictions, should we stop requiring vaccine passports, masks, and so forth? I'm going to tell you that there's a really puzzling gap between the majority position of the public and the expert consensus. And I know a lot of the experts from sitting on this task force. As a sociologist, I know nothing about it, but I've been exposed to all the top virologists and immunologists and epidemiologists, and I've read far more than I wanted to. But I think the consensus position is, yeah, we're probably immeasurably better equipped to deal with this now than we have been at any time, but we're not totally out of the woods. And the idea that we would remove all of the restrictions completely at this stage is not a good idea. We should be at least, waiting another month or so to make sure, for example, that the B2 variant, which some think is as much as 60% more transmissible, doesn't kind of wreak another round of havoc. And the costs of sort of eliminating, of taking away the vaccine passport, for example, which is cost nothing, it's in place and we can show you, definitely encouraged a vaccination rates at rates that wouldn't have occurred without it. Probably explains about 20% of the vaccination in Canada. Why you would remove it right now, particularly when almost half of Canadians have yet to receive a booster, seems like a bad idea. But it's an interesting example where the public say, why are we being served up a decision which conflicts with what most of us think and what most of the experts think? And we've been told that this is being guided by science. And I'll show you that most Canadians think, particularly in some provinces like Ontario through to Alberta, that in fact they're being served up policy answers which are rooted in political convenience or pandering to the upcoming elections rather than to what the science or the experts say, or even the public. You can just see here, this is a question which asks, how would you really describe your situation today? My life never changed. Not many people felt like that some of the anti-vaxxers were in denial. My life is still very disrupted, about 17%. My life is still somewhat disrupted, 39%. So you can see that the instance of those who are still feeling disruption is actually the majority of Canadians. Only 8% think that my life is completely or almost got back to normal. So the idea that people are saying, oh yeah, this is all over is not what we're finding. By the way, this data in the United States produces very similar questions. It was asked by the Kaiser Institute of the Family. They found a little bit larger numbers on the my life never changed and on my life is almost back to normal, but basically very similar, a little more polarized. This question is one which tracks stress levels. And what's interesting is I also, as I mentioned, use more sophisticated clinical tools drawn from things like the Generalized Anxiety Disorder Index. They basically correlate about 0.9%. But what's notable here is that these stress levels, which have been extremely high, are probably double what we would see in a normal period of time. And we really don't have a playbook or a history that tells us what the collective impact of a protracted period of double elevated stress and anxiety will be on not only mental health, but physical health as the pandemic recedes. So so we can now start looking in the rearview mirror and asking Canadians, what do you think has really happened? And what do you think, for example, the major costs have been? How has our society been damaged by the pandemic? And obviously, this has been the biggest collision of both economic and health risks in our history. And there is an immense recognition that it has been extremely damaging. What's interesting is when we give people a series of choices, that what we would call socio-psychological damage, and in particular, concerns about the deep levels of polarization which have emerged, specifically around the pandemic, around the vaccine, but also in more generally, that's seen as the biggest cost of the pandemic. We find, for example, that about a third of Canadians say, I'm no longer talking to someone in my family or my household or a close friend because of disagreements about the pandemic and the vaccine. But we find that this level of polarization is not just sort of at the interpersonal level, it's also at the institutional level. We see distrust has risen, particularly in certain groups, and surprising where the groups are. For example, overall trust in government rose dramatically at the beginning of the pandemic, which was not what happened in the United States or Europe. And the higher levels of trust in government in Canada may well have explained why we did a better job at getting vaccines out than in the United States, because trust is actually the number one predictor of vaccine acceptance. But what we've seen is trust has been eroding, particularly trust in, say, public health officials, but even scientists. And that's been extremely pronounced in this group that are attracted to what we might call the populist or freedom sympathizing segment of the population, which is about a third. That group, which tends to be younger, under 50 at least, non-university but college educated, more common amongst males, now more likely to be white, more likely to be in rural Canada, and they're deeply economically pessimistic, almost non-existent trust in government and institutions, and they are heavily under the influence of disinformation. They don't read the mainstream media, which they consider to be fake news. They don't trust science and doctors or governments, but they're on YouTube or TikTok daily, and they're getting fed all kinds of spurious information, and they're buying it, and it's altering their views. And it's very difficult to convert that. But it was notable that you would think people would say, well, the big costs, obviously, are the economic and fiscal costs. We spent more money than at any time in our history. We're now seeing inflation at a 20-year high. But people rated the economic fiscal costs as important, but secondary to the social and psychological costs. So that I thought that was notable. And you can see here that polarization of our society is seen as the most serious cost of the pandemic. And I think the public might be right. And I'll talk a bit more about this. The level of polarization that we're seeing in Canada, effective polarization, the degree you don't like the person on the other side, but polarization in terms of your fundamental beliefs and value systems, it's really producing a society where there is no middle ground. The potential for consensus and a potential for agreement about what post-pandemic Canada might look like, it's going to be an extremely daunting challenge. People also note, I thought it was interesting, the erosion of trust in governments, public health experts was right at the top. It's notable that in younger Canada, which has higher levels of post-secondary educational attainment than at any period in our history, actually trust in science has dropped. It's still reasonably high, but you would think it would be going up. And so that may augur more poorly for the future. And the fact is that in a lot of younger Canada, particularly younger male Canada, that's where a lot of this sort of populist anger is fomenting, and which is linked to disinformation. Think about the impacts of Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan or the other kinds of extremely popular sources of disinformation that are operating on social media. So trust in government is not bad by historical standards. It's been going down in lockstep in both Canada and the United States for many decades. As we approach the 70s, in both Canada and the United States, the instance people who felt they could trust the government in Washington or Ottawa to do the right thing all or most of the time was around 70%. In both countries, it dropped below 20% recently. That's a dramatic shift. But we also find not only that broad institutional trust, but trust in specific occupations and interpersonal trust of the people on the other side has all been eroding. It's interesting that there's been some sharp differences, though, in the trajectory of the approval and trust that applies to the provincial level as opposed to the federal level. Some of the two senior partners in federalism are getting rated very differently. At the outset, the provinces were seen as doing a better job. They were responsible for healthcare, very high marks in the 80% range. The federal government did okay, it was scoring about 70%. But the provincial government's marks have dropped precipitously. Particularly, they've gone down by 40 points, and even more so in places like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, all of which feature more right-wing populist governments, which I think the public are feeling didn't really pay attention to the science. Here's just a picture of just how different trust today is from in the past, where we've moved from a deferential society that respected authority to one that is openly kind of non-deferential and actually questions authority actively. You can see the trust rose sharply in Canada, but then it's been bouncing around and it sort of came down, maybe is going up a bit again. You can see that the scores that Canadians assign to the various governments they're okay. And I think in reflection, when we ask Canada, how do you think we did collectively? I think Canadians think we did quite well. They know we did much better than, say, our neighbors to the south, which had 4 times the incidence of deaths due to COVID as we did. That was also true of the United Kingdom. So there isn't a sense that we did everything marvelously well. But in terms of, big picture comparisons to other countries, I think there's a sense we did pretty well. And I think there was a sense that we did quite well in terms of the economic backstop that the federal government provided to businesses and citizens, which is remarkable agility for a slow-footed federal bureaucracy to roll out something that looked very much like a guaranteed annual income, literally in a matter of weeks and days, that had, a very significant effect in cushioning the economic fallout from the election. Here you can see that approval of government, for example, is a tremendous predictor of whether or not you think a vaccine passport is a good idea, and more importantly, whether or not you actually received a vaccine. Very strong connections there. Here's the patterns with the provincial government. You see they were up around 78%. In Ontario and Alberta, those numbers were 85%. They've come down precipitously, and more recently, the numbers in Alberta, for example, who feel that their provincial government's handling the pandemic well, is 10%. That's cartoonishly low. The federal government's been a bit more buoyant, and the public are a little more likely to think that not only was there more uniformity in the prescriptions from the federal government, which is not surprising since it is pan-Canadian by definition, but that it did adhere more to science than did some of the provinces, and most notably those provinces I just mentioned, where there's a broad sense of disaffection with approaches which their citizens don't feel, and I think they're correct, were largely ignoring what the experts were saying or what the public would see. And you would see the numbers here, the levels of approval across. You can see what sticks out is just the very low levels of approval in Alberta, only 11%, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, 25%, Ontario, 29%. The rest of the country, pretty good. Those numbers, by the way, in those four provinces that I just mentioned were in the mid 80s a year ago. So that's a really major fall from grace. People believe that the provinces in particular were guiding their response, particularly those ones with the poor rating, on basis of politics and public pressure. This, despite the fact that 86% say that's not what should have been doing. We should have been using science and expertise. So there's a lot of, and this goes to this dilemma, this conundrum, that the public said, look, most of us are in the rational majority. We've done the right things. We've got vaccinated. We got boosted. We followed the guidance. And we're not winning the debate. We're losing to those who, have, strenuously protested and based on positions which were wildly at odds with both the experts and the evidence, but they seem to be winning. And what does that mean for the future, where the majority and the rational positions are actually losing to an irrational minority? And I think that concern, which we saw vividly expressed in the convoy in Ottawa and elsewhere in the country, is probably, I think, underpinning some of the reasons the government's seeking a stability with the NDP, because I don't think they've really figured out a playbook for dealing with this, but doing what most of the public want and what the experts say is no guarantee that you're going to be able to forestall this new threat from authoritarian populist regimes. You can see here that the government of Canada was seen as about almost twice as likely to be adhering to the science. But here you see all governments falling distressingly short of what is a near universal consensus that it should have all been based on the science. I'm just going to move along. I want to talk a bit here about the issue of disinformation. And I clearly distinguish disinformation from misinformation. I can misinform you by accident by telling you something I think is true, which is false. But if I consciously am telling you things I know are false and trying to manipulate you and to wreak havoc, that's disinformation. And this particular phenomena, which really wasn't a major factor. We've had conspiracy theories for a long time. I remember back when I was studying in graduate school, looking at Why Prophecy Fails, which was a fascinating study of millennial cults and how the group who all believed that they were going to go up in a spacecraft at a certain day and were marking the days and so forth. The day occurred, and instead of abandoning the conspiracy, they just said, oh, no, the counter's wrong, let's redo it. But now we see the same sorts of phenomena, but supercharged with kind of the Cambridge Analytica AI-driven a disinformation being targeted at bluntly a fairly gullible, low information portion of the citizenry, and it's extremely effective. So we looked at some basic measures, and we brought some questions were asked in the United States just so we could see what was the distribution and frequency of disinformation in Canada compared to the United States. And you know what? We found it was the same, with notable exceptions, the same levels of disinformation on issues like whether the COVID vaccine could cause infertility or alter your DNA, or whether ivermectin was a safe and effective, all of which are demonstrably not true. But a sizable portion of people either think they are true or aren't sure. And so we could array people on a continuum from those who got everything correct, which was only about a third of Canadians, to those who got everything wrong, which was about a 10% fringe group on the end. What's interesting is that as you progressed up this continuum of disinformation, the impacts were really relatively modest. The minor levels of uncertainty about issues didn't cause much difference. But as we got into the upper half, say past the 60% level of the population, we could see progressively profound impacts which got larger and larger in a straight monotonic progression. So those people who were most disinformed were 100% opposed to the use of passports or masks, whereas those who were well informed were literally 100% vaccinated and 98% supportive. So you couldn't see more polar differences. Now, what was more troubling is as you move from the extremes, that it appeared that the disinformation was having an impact in a wider portion of the population who really weren't paying all that much attention, but were perhaps feeling insecurity and anxiety about the future for economic reasons and other factors, but they were being converted in less extreme forms, but nonetheless converted to the same positions as those on the polarized, disinformed end of the continuum. And that's troubling because if you get up to an incidence of, say, 35% of the public on a given position, in Canada with our first past the post system, where in our recent polling, we don't find it's unusual for no party to get over 30 points, you can form a government. And if we go back in history, and for all those who feel they want a quick checkup on this, I recommend Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny, written in 2017, where he talked about the conflicts in the area around Ukraine, but also went back to look at what were the guideposts, what were the indicators that we should be mindful about before tyranny overtook society. And he was obviously looking at things like the rise of fascism in America, not America, in Europe in the 20th century, but other examples as well. And if you go through and read that checklist and compare to what we're seeing with the use of what we call an index of ordered populism, which is a derivation of measurements that were developed by Theodor Adorno, who was a sociologist who came from Germany, along with Hannah Arendt and others following the Second World War, trying to understand how Germany, which had been the most civilized society on the planet, had fallen into the abyss of the Holocaust and all those horrors. Their best explanation after was that it was an exploitation of a certain personality type. Actually, Adorno himself thought it was more of a worldview or Weltanschauung rather than a personality, but he was working with social psychologists. So he made that concession, but they came up with measuring instruments, which did a pretty good job. And they kind of languished for many years and were given fresh life when a number of sociologists and others found that these were remarkably predictive of both Trump and Brexit. And so, for example, I'll give you one example. In the received wisdom after Brexit, which was a big shock to everybody, as was Trump, was that this was largely a product of geography. So if you lived in the downtown urban core of London, you would be a stayer. If you lived in the burned out factory districts or the failed coal mines in the rural parts of the UK, you would be a leaver. That they put those terms into an exit poll, and they improved the ability to predict the outcome of the referendum by 5 percentage points, which is significant, but not dramatic. A smart sociologist said, let's try this. And he put an indicator in that asked the question, I think sex criminals should be whipped in prison. The explanation jumped to 70%. What do you think that's measuring? And that was a key ingredient of part of Adorno's model of authoritarian, which was actually 12-dimensional. But this same sort of force is very much what's reshaping the political and societal landscapes in Canada, United States, and UK, and so forth. And people say, well, it's populist. Yes, it is. And populism itself is ideologically neutral. We can find expressions of populism across the ideological spectrum. The underlying unifying features of populism is a belief that the elites exercise inordinate power, and that power should be restored to the people. The people often means my people rather than the people writ large. But the application of populism that you would find on the center, on the left, and on the right are quite different. You could argue that populism underpinned the Roosevelts and the New Deal, which produced one of the most positive transformations and the production of an era of shared prosperity, rise of the middle class, and so forth, which never would have been possible without it. But the more authoritarian populism, or what Snyder would call tyranny, or what I would call ordered populism, this thing never turns out well, okay? At the very best case, it turns out to deeply disappoint those who are attracted to it. But in the worst case, it ends up as a disaster, as we saw in the examples of what happened in Europe in the early 20th century. So the fact that we now see this polarization and populism is being fueled in ways that it wasn't. It was always disinformation. Both Goebbels and Trotsky agreed that a lie repeated often enough became the truth, a good kind of guideline for the fascist playbook. But they never would have imagined the ability to target that using artificial intelligence and an internet, which could instantly pivot and target that with micro efficiency. And that's why I think we should be really alarmed about how this is reshaping outlook in our society and other society. I won't go through this in any number. You can look at it later. It is interesting to see that the numbers in the United States are very similar, which suggests, unlike in the past, we've used a measure of authoritarian outlook, which we call order outlook, which asks questions about child rearing, not politics. Pew's used the same indicator in the States. We found that in Canada, it was about a third of Canadians, whereas in the States, it's about 45%. I'm not sure that it's not rising in Canada, because this disinformation gap, which is driving it, there's only picayune differences between the penetration in Canada and the United States, which means it's coming from the same sources, which I thought would be mostly American. But I'll tell you right now, and I'll show you some reasons I think, in addition to emanating from those who are trying to, pursue basically anarchy, using these tools, I think it's also a tool of statecraft, which is being used by other countries. And I'll show you where I think a lot of it, I've seen evidence that a lot of the disinformation that's now emanating from Russia is being picked up by right-wing disinformation amplifiers in the United States and having immediate and dramatic impacts in our country, as well as in Europe. So vaccine refusal is directly related to disinformation. For example, on those who were the most disinformed, only 1 in 4 had been vaccinated, whereas in the highly informed, literally 100% had been vaccinated. You can see that this one just shows a fairly illustrative linkage of the index to trust in science, to public health experts, and you can see as you move up the scale in a straight line monotonic progression, trust collapses as you become more disinformed. And once that's established, and once you become radicalized by these beliefs, it's extremely difficult to turn that around. Here you see the incidence of those who've been vaccinated based on disinformation. You can see literally everybody who's on the high information, highly informed is vaccinated, and then that just starts declining as you move out to the disinformed fringe. This is even more clear now when we look at the instances of those who have been boosted. And we've now found that the large group of people who have had 2 vaccinations, particularly under 50 males, working class, who are also consuming disinformation, say, I was forced to do that, I'm not doing any more. And so this is not restricted just to this group. It cascades, has a contagion effect, which is much broader. This final linkage on disinformation, and this one looks at support for vaccine passports. So whether nobody likes the idea of telling anybody that, you have to show your passport to get into the gym or get on a plane, but the evidence is overwhelmingly that it's highly effective, that in fact it accelerates. I'll give you a quick example. France introduced its pass sanitaire midsummer. they had exactly the same vaccination levels as the United States at that point. I think about 53%. France is now vaccinated at close to 90%. The United States is at 60%. What was the difference? The introduction of the vaccine passport. I can show you micro level data that support that conclusion as well. And what I'm saying here now is that disinformation, this isn't just a concomitant covariation. This is not a random controlled experiment, but I am 100% certain that there is a causal relationship going on. The more disinformation you get, the more mistrustful you are, the more likely you're not to get vaccinated and to oppose any measures designed to ensure that others get vaccinated. So now I want to just, I'm almost through because I want to leave some time for discussion, but I want to show you how rapidly disinformation can pivot and shift from, let's say, a discussion about masks and vaccines and passports to another area. And I can tell you at the beginning of the pandemic, people's attitudes to masks and attitudes to vaccines, they had little relationship to each other.
Oh, no.
As the pandemic went on, they became tightly interwoven, as did all the other outlooks, because they were all being steered by the same sources of disinformation. So I was looking at, and I really wasn't even testing this explicitly, I was looking at the impact of the invasion of Russia of Ukraine. I was really interested in what impacts it was having on mental distress in Canada, as well as just questions about where public sympathies were. And the answers were quite clear. First of all, it was elevating public anxieties dramatically, that just as we'd gotten through the worst part of a once in a lifetime global pandemic, we're now staring at a possible global nuclear war. And this was having an unsurprisingly a really negative effect on people's levels of anxiety, sleeplessness, and so forth. But I also want to know, okay, so what do you think about how the response? Do you think are the Russians responsible for this? Are the measures that we're bringing to deal with this effective, or do you support them? And we found that overwhelmingly Canadians said, yeah, the Russians are definitely at fault here. The vast majority think what they're doing is war crimes. They don't buy the arguments that they're there to denazify or that there's bioweapons or any of that stuff. When asked about what we should be doing, they're strongly supportive of aid. They're strongly supportive of strong economic sanctions, even if they're at the expense of raising inflation and affordability issues for Canadians. There's significant support for no-fly zones. There's strong support for provision of lethal and non-lethal equipment to those armies. The Ukrainian armies are military. There's more division when you look at issues like whether we should actually be engaging in boots on the ground, where most say not. But the point is, most Canadians say we should be doing all those things, and we think Russia's really wrong. So I looked at that and I thought, let's break this down by vaccine refusers. And also, let's break it down by those who've only had 2 doses of vaccine versus those who've been boosted. And I was shocked, I really was, to find that, for example, vaccine refusers were 14 times more likely to disagree that the Russians were committing war crimes, 26 more times more likely to say that Canada should do nothing. And I've seen in my most recent data, they're far more likely to think, yeah, you know what? They were dealing with abuses to Russian speakers in southern Ukraine, and there are bioweapons being manufactured, all stuff which is patently untrue. And it just shows you, because if you can imagine that the average sort of freedom convoy sympathizer who's not reading anything but is on YouTube is suddenly coming up with opinions about the presence of bioweapons in Ukraine. No, they didn't pull it out of the thin air. This was targeted at them, and it was targeted with precision and effectiveness. And I think that's really daunting to see how much this sort of stuff can, how rapidly it can pivot. And I suspect we'll see the same targeting of this sort of disinformation going on with all the key issues which will emanate after the pandemic recedes, possibly at the top of the list, issues like what to do about the climate change or climate emergency. But here you can just see how strong the patterns are. If I've gotten I've been boosted, I reject out of hand the idea that the Russians were justified in invading. If I've had a couple of those, hey, look, I'm starting to toy with that. There's a sizable group that aren't sure, I think maybe it's the case. But as I move into the vaccine reviews, I'm more likely to think that's true than false. That's really kind of shocking. This is only like weeks after this has happened. And nonetheless, we see these effects registering immediately. Another quick comparison, I'm pretty well through after this. Here's a comparison of what vaccinated Canada thinks about imposing tougher economic sanctions on Russia. Absolutely, seizing assets, massive supermajority agreements. You can see the patterns here. That gets a little more tepid and mixed as we move to the more, direct military engagement thing. But consistently, look at the numbers, and perhaps to encapsulate this, only 2% of vaccinated Canada thinks we shouldn't be doing anything. 52% of unvaccinated Canada thinks we shouldn't be doing anything. That's a pretty jarring gap. Okay, so just a few conclusions. We're finding basically that disinformation is playing out in a circumscribed portion of the population. It tends to be younger Canada, not kids, but under 50. It tends to be non-university educated. It tends to be more recently white. It tends to be male. It tends to be rurally located, and it tends to be more common in the prairies. But this is evident throughout Canada. Those are the demographics. The psychographics, this group is deeply economically pessimistic. They're many more times likely to think that the economy is in depression or a savage recession. They do not see an optimistic economic future. They're 3 times as likely to express hostility to outgroups, which is a polite way of saying much higher levels of racism. They're 3 times as likely to say there's too many visible minorities in the country. And they also have very clear partisan preferences, which are on the conservative or the People's Party, or conservative side of the spectrum. They're dramatically more sympathetic to the convoy protests, which surprisingly, for those who've looked at actually what went on, are really more of a source of horror than admiration. But that support ranges from 25 to 40% of Canadians. The use of traditional media and official sources declines precipitously with this group as disinformation rises, as does institutional mistrust. So I think we're beginning to get a handle on just how profound the impacts are and how corrosive they are on trust and polarization. But the question of what do we do about it is something where I'm kind of scratching my head, because the usual playbook that the rational majority would say, well, we just got to get the facts out, we got to reason, we've got to be sympathetic. None of that's likely to have any impact whatsoever, because they're just not listening, and they're driven by moral certainty, not reason and evidence. I'm just going to skip through this final stuff and draw a few, just a couple of interesting points here. You can see in terms of what we do about it, some people say, well, we regulate traditional media, print media, television are regulated with the CRT, they have oversight. You can't go saying crazy things like are being said on YouTube or on Facebook. Maybe we need the same approach there. That unfortunately does not get really strong support. There's people that say that's a good idea. And I know there's a number of countries talking to each other that think this might be precisely what we need to do. But it will absolutely be seized by the other part of the spectrum to say, well, look, you're actually you're tampering with free speech, and this is offensive, and you shouldn't do it. I know on my task force, some of the members have been doing this for a long time, say, look, we need to reach out, engage influentials in social media who counter these false messages. They've tried some experiments with this. Good luck. They all gave up after about a week of being beat up by hordes of trolls. And so it's a tough challenge. But just ignoring it is not an option either, because you can see that it's reshaping democracies in extremely unhealthy ways. And I think we have to be. This is, if one a topic for future research, kind of understanding not just the causes and consequences, but responses to disinformation and its linkages to polarization and mistrust is something that should be at the top of the list. So you can see here, there isn't really a clear mandate to go ahead with the traditional approach. So just a couple of concluding observations. Why does this authoritarian outlook, why did it appear? And there's a lot of scholarship that's been going on for a lot of time trying to understand it. And most of it traces it to things which have been going on for decades. It doesn't all agree, but at the top of the list is something hyper concentration of wealth at the top and dramatic changes in the class structure of the societies where it's occurring. So I can show you that at the beginning of the century in Canada, United States, self-identified membership in the middle class was about 70%. It's dropped to under 50% in both countries. So 60 million Americans, 7 million Canadians fell out of the middle class. They didn't go into the upper class, trust me. A lot of the jobs which were produced a secure future where you could buy a house and retire in comfort with a strong back and a union card, they've disappeared due to automation, deindustrialization. That's produced not just economic anxieties, but a sense of status and identity loss. My sense of my value as a breadwinner, it's also linked to feelings of social dominance. The values I used to believe in are no longer the dominant values. That's why you see, such condemnation of critical race theory and alternative treatments of replacement theory and all of these things. A strong cultural backlash, a magnified sense that the world outside has become very dangerous, so we should pull up the drawbridge and turn back the clock. So both of these are at core drivers. But basically, I think if we step back, we realize that people didn't become more racist, become more economically despairing because they became more racist. It was the other way around. So the causal sequencing is important to understand. And perhaps if we really want to deal with the root causes, you have to understand how to recreate an economics which produces shared prosperity, as we did in most of the 20th century. Just a couple of comparisons of people who think that this is just another iteration of the left-right continuum. Not really. The left-right axis was all about collectivism versus individualism, small government versus active government, whether societal ills were socially produced or environmentally determined, or individuals authored their own problems, whether you should respond with punishment or rehabilitation. Those are the traditional left-right debates. These debates are about cosmopolitanism versus a parochial altruism, about anywheres versus somewheres. This is the idea of, you've got the global elite that are in airport lounges going to Davos to think of schemes that'll make them rich and screw you. Pro-diversity immigration and deep reservations, these differences existed before, but they were a fraction of the depth that they are today. And they're sorted now on this dimension more so. Deep optimism about the future, deep pessimism about the future. Your typical Republican voter and conservative voter before this century unfolded was a suburban college-educated voter who believed in small government and lower taxes. That's just not the kind of people who were storming the Capitol, nor the type of people who were in the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa. Reason and evidence becomes subordinate to moral certainty. And when tasking when you're raising kids, is it more important to stress creativity or good behavior? It's a key indicator of which side of this you fall on. I'll show you how strongly this index predicted our last election, which was almost as strong as it is as strong as it predicted the last American election. So we do see in good news, people think the pandemic's ending, the stress related to that's dissipating. On the bad news side, they don't think we're going back to normal, and they're very fearful of the levels of polarization now looking very fearfully at geopolitical tensions, which look like they could evolve into a global conflict. So it's a very uncertain environment. The public don't believe that the future is going to look the same. They believe it's going to be more polarized. They believe we're going to see dramatically different workplaces. The guys on the freedom side are really concerned that we're moving to a more controlled society, particularly ones where there's going to be more surveillance and control. There's not a lot of evidence to support that, although there is some evidence to support that. those individuals have dramatically lower levels of trust in government. They're more contained in younger rather than older Canada, and they're more likely to be non-university educated. And this key fault lining is now the most important driver of polarization, which is dividing Canada. That's a tour of what I've been seeing in the last couple of years. I'd be glad to take any comments or questions. Thank you.
All right, many thanks, Frank, for that very interesting and fascinating talk that really lays out many of the issues surrounding both the pandemic and also thinking about sources of disinformation, the rise of populism. So you really gave us quite the overview of a number of trends that are going on within Canada. So thank you very much for that. So I'd like just to open it now for questions. You can ask your question either by raising your hand and turning on your camera, or alternatively, you can ask a question in the chat as well if you prefer to do that alternatively. Kareem.
Yes, thank you very much for this, and thank you very much, Mr. Frank, for speaking. So I have a question. I'm not sure how to form, have you come across in your research, because this is something that I have come across in talking to a lot of people from different socioeconomic structures and levels and different forms of the political spectrum, because I have a habit of liking to talk to everybody and anybody. So from the staunch Trump supporters, like people who want Trump to be like president of Canada and the United States, like that's their dream, and to people who really hate him. And one of the things that I came across, which I didn't hear in the presentation today, but you somewhat alluded to, is people feel disrespected. And I think this is highly troubling for me, because I feel like this is something that nobody's willing to address. And even when you mentioned we're going to ask influencers to convince people, but it's like, why should people be convinced? Because I feel like a part of the problem is people don't feel valued and respected. And one of the things that I find I get a lot of leeway with is when I make it seem to people that I respect you, I value you, and I feel like you have something to offer. Now, we may disagree on a lot of stuff and we hash it out, but I feel like that's something that's missing. So could you elaborate on that if you came across people feeling like I feel disrespected or something to that effect? Because I feel that that's crucial.
I have some questions on interpersonal trust, which suggest that that's been going down. I also have evidence that about a third of Canadians say that the pandemic has produced fissures, acute fissures in their families and their close friendship networks, people that they may never talk to again, or they can't reconcile. We'll see if that actually becomes the case. So I think there is a lot of, I don't know if respect is a good word, but it's just more of kind of a lack of trust, a lack of solidarity, a lack of social cohesion. Those things I think have all been products of this rise in polarization. It's interesting that one of the approaches to polarization, which we haven't measured, but I want to look at, which is related to what we're looking at, is what some authors call affective polarization. And affective polarization is the degree to which you really detest the person with opposing partisan views. And the research, to the point where, for example, I wouldn't want my daughter marrying a liberal, or vice versa, or I wouldn't really want them to be in my club. And what's happened and particularly in Canada and the United States, there's multi-country studies which have gone back 20, 30 years and show that Canada and the United States are relatively unique in having a sharp rise in affective polarization. So unlike in the past where we had what sociologists used to call multiple role affiliations and cross-cutting loyalties. So I might not like your politics, but we're on the same hockey team, or I really kind of enjoy your car, your dog. That stuff has really, it's been difficult for it to penetrate the intense bad feelings or affective polarization that's kind of dominated. I mean, it's not historically natural to have the levels of division and hatred and lack of mutual respect and that you are seeing going on in our country and the United States today. Those are not normal and they're not healthy. And so yes, I think now is the solution. I don't know. I mean, I have on my list of things to test whether or not actively reminding people about things like what we used to call cross-cutting loyalties and multiple role affiliations is a good idea. I also am trying to use some tools that we've developed in the past, which other sociologists have developed and used as well, which are tools for citizen engagement. Yanklevich used to talk about coming to public judgment. Others talked about deliberative democracy and so forth. But the idea you would put together groups of statistically representative, scientifically representative groups, and you would give them all shared information and some values tests and say, okay, work it out amongst yourselves. Let's come up with some advice to decision makers about how to square some of these imponderably incommensurable dilemmas. They actually work quite well, and it's surprising we don't use these, because I think they might be a helpful piece of a tool, helpful to have in the toolkit right now, just to remind people, because most people aren't actually considering the other person at an interpersonal level anymore. They're kind of almost demonized or polarized them into these two different tribes or camps. And so anything that can break that down. But I think ultimately, we also have to look at policy tools and say, okay, it's not a good thing that you have a generation that feels that positive social mobility is no longer possible, that feels that getting a house is no longer on for their generation, and that feels that their place in the future is not secure. So I think you really have to go back to looking at recreating what some call, like Asmaglu talks about, extractive and inclusive economies. And his argument is that nations fail when they move from inclusive to extractive economies. And I think we have a vivid illustration of that going on in both Canada and the United States, but we're not quite there yet. Anyway.
All right, thank you, Frank. I'll now pass it over to Carol.
Thanks, Carlos. And thank you, Frank, for a very fascinating conversation. And I appreciate the fact that it's recorded, because I think I'm going to have to re-listen, because there's just like there's been a salt of information. So I appreciate that. Quick question around the fact that I noticed that through your presentation and through the presentation data, you've been referring to the binary of like and hatred. And I was wondering, and I do know from my own personal experience that, of course, polling sort of has like gazillion levels of gray and references. I was wondering if you could sort of elaborate a little bit about how you defined some of your categories for the questions, and if you could elaborate a bit more on how you defined anger or dislike versus hatred in the responses of some of the questions you asked.
I don't specifically use terms like hatred. That's more my editorializing in terms of judging some of the intensity of the emotional responses that seem to accompany these things, but it's not an empirical observation. I do use terms like anger and hope and a lot of other things, and I do test specifically values to find out how resonant values are with different members of the population. So, for example, I've been tracking for a long time which values people think are most important for society, and they're interesting because they provide. They're much more glacial than public opinion. They're kind of moral goalposts that define what kind of society we want to hand off to their children, or what ultimate questions define good and bad, right and wrong. And I've noticed recently that values have all been going down, which is kind of surprising and disturbing. I think an indicator of a decline in social cohesion, and the values as well themselves have been somewhat morphing. So historically, Canadians would cite freedom as the top value. and when we've tested this, and that's also a top value in the comparative world values work that's been going on during this period as well. But recently we've seen a sharper decline in the subscription of the value of freedom, and it's become appropriated by part of the political spectrum in a way that it wasn't in the past. So, and I'm wondering again, is that a reflection of this deepening polarization and ideologization of the public? At the close of the century, when we asked Canadians to identify themselves as, are you mostly a small L liberal, forget about how you vote, or a small C conservative, 50% said I'm neither. That number has dropped to about 10%. So, Daniel Bell famously spoke about the end of ideology, and it looked like Canada had almost arrived at that position, but it all collapsed in a pretty short period of time. So, no, I wouldn't. The other terms, items I use in my modeling are more conventional attitudinal questions that don't use language like that. The tools I use to measure Adorno, it's kind of the Adorno legacy, are simple questions on child rearing, which have been developed and used in other settings by other sociologists and work really quite well in terms of fitting some of the current environment. But I think that it's much more complex, and there is a lot of gray, but I would argue that the gray in our society is increasingly being replaced by a big black and white polarization, where the kind of intermediate positions in the center. Again, remember, just to use politics as an indicator, it wasn't unusual in the 80s and 90s to see political parties enjoying 50% support. Today, it's not uncommon to see no party over 30 points. And then, so you really wonder, and that's similar to what's been going on in Europe with the hollowing of the center and the kind of more expression on the more extreme sides of the left and right, although I argue it's an open ordered spectrum. So yeah, there's a lot of big changes going on, and I'm not sure we've fully captured or cataloged them yet and where they're going to arrive. But I definitely believe that polarization is a much more common feature today than it was in the past. And actually Canadians tell me that as well. As I showed when I was cataloging the costs of the pandemic, which are legion, huge costs. At the top of the list was people were most concerned about how it had polarized our society.
Okay, so I see there's a question from Mariana in the chat. So I'm not sure, Mariana, if you want to ask your question in person, or would you like me to read out your question?
Yeah. Hello. Yeah, I was just wondering if you had any ideas on how people could not fall into disinformation or protect themselves from disinformation or something around those lines, because as you've shown, that kind of leads into distrust and then other negative consequences in society.
That's a great question, and I can start with the flippant answers. But if you're asking the question, you're enormously less likely to fall into the kind of victims of mistrust and disinformation. But it's a deeper question, an important question. You could argue that there is research showing that these disinformation preys on frankly gullible, low-informed citizens. So improving the levels of critical reasoning and education would be one antidote, you would think. It would seem in some of the stuff I'm seeing on what's going on in universities that there's a movement away from kind of developing critical reasoning skills to let's get the hard skills, which will provide the technical ability to get your jobs in the new economy, which is not a bad idea as well. But I don't think we should lose sight of the importance of critical reasoning. I know I was on a conference call with a bunch of international people dealing with this very issue this morning who are, top level strategists, and they don't have any magic answers, but there's a bunch of kind of labs and experts that are working to quickly inject the correct evidence into the spheres of social media where the disinformation is flowing. That may be, part of the answer, that we just, if a lie repeated often enough becomes the truth, as both Goebbels and Trotsky said, then maybe the truth repeated quickly enough and frequently enough will restore the truth. That's something we're not necessarily very good at. To be blunt, the agility and speed of the purveyors of disinformation is more impressive from those who are trying to play defense. But that's got to change. The other area I think there's a lot of agreement is that we need to have more careful oversight of the tech giants who are making a fortune, often, harvesting private information, which is being used in the service of precisely these kinds of things. You could read the Undoing Project as kind of as a review of some of that, but it's evolved even more so since then. But yeah, there are probably oversight and regulatory responses to this which need to be looked at. My view is that they won't be successful unless they're enjoined transnationally, because you cannot attack this within the boundaries of a single country, because bluntly, social media, internet are moving all over the world at light speed. But those would be some thoughts on how we should confront it. But I would strongly urge those who are coming up with research questions and for the future to make this prominent on the list, because I believe it's something we really need to pick up our game. We need a better understanding of how to respond to this effectively.
So, Frank, I have one question for you around sort of you often point to sort of young men as often having the sense of kind of victimhood or lost opportunity. And I'm just kind of curious because obviously you've been conducting this research for over the course of 20 years. So I'm wondering, just looking at some of your data sort of just longitudinally, what kinds of changes have you seen within that particular age group, say from, say like 15, 20 years ago, as opposed to now, and some of the kind of changes which are going in, between men between the ages of say 18 to 35?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's changed a lot. So if we look at generational studies of how various cohorts evolved, the boomers through to the Gen X, Gen Y, the Gen Z, and so forth. Typically, we don't see the levels of division on gender that we are seeing with the current cohort. In fact, I don't think we've ever seen as wide a gap, and that's expressed like on questions. Like I ask questions about, okay, how many deaths would be okay to restore a level of normalcy in society? What would be tolerant? We know that, we have say 4,000 flu deaths a year, and that's really a problem, but we don't wear masks or shut down businesses and so forth. So what are the levels? It's a kind of blunt morality of mortality phrasing. But the responses I got from men under 50 versus women under 50 were unbelievably different. And on a number of other indicators, like 30, 40 point differences. So you had many young men who are going, I'm good with 50,000 deaths a year, which is bluntly more deaths than we've had since the pandemic arrived. And I think they're sort of almost serious. It's not like they just don't care, because it's probably not going to be me. Although I think they're exaggerating their invulnerability. But those types of gender gaps within generation are the biggest I've ever seen. And they also express themselves in terms of partisan preferences as well. So I find, for example, that recently, like you would think that the People's Party would be a magnet for, the kind of the traditional Reform Party supporter or the older angry guys. No, it was much more popular amongst young males. Young women had no interest in it for the most part. They were far more attracted to the NDP. So big divisions on that front. And I also think if you look at the consumption pattern, I've looked at this a bit, social media consumption patterns, young males are far more likely to be consuming disinformation, particularly on YouTube. And if you look at how magnetic Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, for example, here's my rules for living. I just got back from Siberia from being in rehab and suicidal, but I'm going to give you rules for living. And it doesn't matter. People are going, yeah, that's great. Jordan's really got this all figured out. And I'm going, that's you gotta explain that one to me. But but this influence in that part of the age spectrum is, and more so with men, is really quite striking. And I don't think we've encountered that before.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. I think we're seeing that, in the sense of, even within the case of sociology, I would say even in the time that I've been in the Department of Sociology, we've seen less men, I would say, enroll in our department in comparison to previous years. So I think that concern with social justice, social problems has lessened in that kind of interest amongst male, as opposed to a greater preponderance of females who are now enrolling on our department. So we can see it across a number of spectrums as well. So thank you, Frank.
Interesting. Just a quick follow-up on that. And then it's become almost the pillorying of the academy, some of which is justified, to be blunt. I mean, a lot of it, most of it isn't, but the kind of pillorying of critical race theory. And I saw for example, you might have seen The Economist wrote, did a piece about 4 editions ago called The Great Awakening. And they actually documented their cases empirically, showing that in the liberal elite establishments of America and universities, they were tracking indicators of measures of tolerance for various sorts of things, measuring statements like, I don't think that Black people work hard enough and stuff like that. And they'd accelerated dramatically the more favorable positions, whereas in the Black community itself, there hadn't been any changes. And they would also use examples, for example, the requirement for editorial boards like the New York Times to use the term Latinx. And they saw surveys where 99% of Latino women said, no, I'm a Latino woman, not a Latinx. Now, that has been weaponized and used particularly by guys like Peterson and others, to create a completely false presentation about academic freedom and so forth. But I think we have to be mindful that stuff is seductive to a lot of more naive consumers of this stuff, and that we need to probably be mindful that we don't damage the more important goals we're pursuing by giving them ammunition. That's a very complicated topic. I hate even getting into it.
Mm-hmm. No, but one that
it's extremely difficult. But we need, and by the way, one of the reasons I'm not a big fan of oversight of social media is, even though I see these incredibly toxic impacts, I'm a pretty firm believer in free speech, which is critical to a healthy academy. The ability that you're allowed to, speak your mind, and it doesn't mean you can yell fire in a crowded theater, but you should be able to say things which people don't like and which are then the other people which are demonstrably wrong. And there's a belief that for whatever reason that's being stifled. I think that's an exaggeration in the other direction.
Yeah, or the other option is that what will happen is that people will just move on to other channels, right? So if you regulate one channel, and as we're seeing now, people will switch over to Telegram or to other kinds of channels where they can communicate freely. So that that's always a problem.
I got that one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's okay. Actually, I was going to give the opportunity to Kareem to ask the question or make a comment.
Yeah, sorry. It's just something that's been on my chest. I feel like it has to come out. And so I'll put it in the form of a question, like, what role are scientists what role are scientists playing in causing this harm? And it's not just scientists, there's other groups of people, I refer to as excuse my language, like idiots with PhDs, because I feel like there's too much of this talking down to, and I feel like it's a very simple excuse to pin it down on Joe Rogan or a YouTube channel here or a podcast there, because I have like firsthand experience to talking with people that have PhDs and like in the sociology department or in the criminology department and other sorts of things like that. And there's this idea that I have a PhD, I know everything, you don't have a PhD. And there's a lot of very harmful stuff that they talk, like we don't have time to get into it now, but there's a lot of stuff in the mainstream media that's been promoted that's just terribly wrong. It just doesn't have that title associated with it as disinformation or misinformation. And somehow that becomes okay because we've made certain associations, okay, that's misinformation, but this is not. And one big example is, for example, in the field of addictions and mental health, which prompted me to write a book, almost 400 pages now, in how much misinformation we have on the topic, but nobody refers to it as misinformation. As a matter of fact, my position looks like it's the deranged one, unless I'm having conversation with people and they say, okay, now I get it. But so I feel like there's a lot of picking and choosing and hammering down that is counterproductive.
Yeah, I take your point of view, and I have two comments, one more long-term and one immediate. Like we've seen, like first of all, when I measure disinformation, I'm pretty careful to I'm not picking areas that are controversial. For example, I know at the beginning of the pandemic, we were seeing the public wanted to use masks, and they did use masks despite the fact that all of the experts were saying, oh no, this comes from fomites and droplets. It's not aerosol transmitted, and masks will actually produce what they call risk homeostasis. It was all bullshit. Sorry. It was just completely wrong. But nonetheless, this was coming from esteemed experts like Fauci, Dr. Tam, and others. And, so the public figured out that was wrong. And so the idea that you have, if anything, the kind of movable feast of public experts on what was driving the pandemic out of response has been a humbling experience indeed for those who claim that scientific authority is kind of absolute. The other point, though, that I think is probably more important is if we look at the someone trying to sell me a drain. Okay, sorry. If we look at the evolution of, if I trace the problems where we see the collapse of an inclusive economy and shared prosperity, which I think is what's triggered a lot of these problems. They really began they started in the 70s, but were really culminated in the 90s. And if you read a guy like Robert Reich, who was in the cabinet with Clinton, and at the time wrote a book which I was totally persuaded by, which was part of this whole range of things on the topic of the new class. Alvin Gouldner was writing about it. It was highly influential in the UK with New Labour, and it was influential in Canada. But the basic idea was you get yourself an education, human capital, and you've got a ticket to prosperity, and you're going to be in charge of things. So the idea that symbolic analysts and technical intelligentsia would be running the show, and they would replace traditional capital, and that everybody would be floated on a cloud of knowledge. And so it was all a big lie. It didn't happen. Reich candidly admits that it was a big mistake. Instead of kind of supporting wages and an inclusive economy, they went down this route, and you ended up with old capital, just ruling the show. And in fact, if you look at some of Piketty's most recent work on the gaps across educational, this resentment and this sense of smug superiority probably captured best in a single moment by Hillary Clinton's response in the election to call the group that she found offensive a basket full of deplorables. All that did was added fuel to the fire, and probably it may well have cost her election. But it was also more reflective of this disdain, this contempt that the intellectual class had for those who are less privileged. And so I do think this is a big problem. And I do think it's fueling a lot of the anger and disaffection. And I don't believe it's, Joe Rogan and Peterson are normally easily influenced, but I know there's far more to it than that. I was just trying to use them as examples of those who actually provide a resonant response to this kind of anger.
Yeah, I guess the other question I have, Frank, is thinking about, disinformation. And so, your talk often focuses on, some of the consequences of disinformation. And I'm just wondering, like, who benefits from this disinformation? Because, I think about the history of disinformation, with some of the psyops that the US government conducted in places like, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Central America. That was around trying to, manipulate a population and the like. And it was, purposeful, disinformation campaigns. Whereas now, so who is in some ways, shaping or controlling this disinformation? Because obviously there has to be a certain amount of effort, labor that goes into producing these YouTube videos, that, text, clickbait, all this kind of stuff. So like who's benefiting from this disinformation, and who's kind of behind this information? Is it, state actors? Is it other people, like the Jordan Petersons of the world who, want to spout their own message? So yeah, who's producing this stuff?
Really complicated question. I think some of it's just driven by a need for recognition and authentication. That's I've seen all kinds of stuff where people who are feeling relatively insecure, not getting much attention, find it with the right type of messaging on the right platform. All of a sudden, they're getting a plethora of followers, and that's kind of, then they go into the ecology of the information, of disinformation, and it's a very seductive lure. That's one. And it can also be well-paying. I've seen evidence that some of the most prolific sites spewing disinformation are making a lot of money in the process of doing it, those individuals. Then there's probably even darker sources, like, is it the case that, we've seen a lot of the information coming out of things like the Barrington Convention, okay? Extremely well funded with, qualified, recognized experts saying things which were demonstrably just not true. But when you go back and look at the funding, you see it was traced back to the Koch brothers and some of the moneyed interests that are really interested in not seeing, the best equilibrium of lives saved and, economic costs. They just want to get the economy going again. I think that had a lot to do with it. I think the other factor that's less well understood is just cyber warfare and disinformation as a tool of statecraft. And I think we're just getting a sense of how challenging and difficult that one is. And they all sort of interact, and they have a lot of these networks know each other. A lot of these are also linked to right-wing groups that have very specific political agendas. And so it's a very complex ecology. And again, I don't have a good answer. I know what parts of the answers are, but it's probably a blend of us. I do know that the evidence is that once those people have tipped into the disinformed state, they can be recovered, but only with enormous effort. And we don't have the resources to do that on a large scale. Anyway.
Yeah, which is very worrying.
Yeah, it's very worrying. This one keeps me up at night.
Yeah. Actually, I have a whole bunch of questions here for you today, Frank. So I'm just curious about how, because at the very beginning of your talk, you talked about how you do a random probability sample. And so how do you actually, I'm actually just curious in the actual, mechanics of how you conduct your surveys, and how that has changed over time. Because I know we often hear in the press that, many people are not, responding to surveys. Have you seen over the course of time, this, reluctance of people willing to respond to survey questions? Also, are you also contacting, mobile phone numbers? Are you using a combination of email, online? What's the actual mechanics of how you conduct a survey?
Well, we'll have another session on that one, because that's an extremely complicated an extremely important question. Because parts of disinformation, I think, are flowing from a plethora of panels that are full of clickbots and farms from, China and other countries that are, and Pew Research was done excellent. You want to read on the questions of how research methodology should be modernized in a way that it still produces scientific accuracy. Just go through the methodology papers with Pew. They're very, very good, but there's lots of other sources as well. But basically, unfortunately in Canada, my view is, and this is not a public comment, but the vast majority of the research you see in polling research emanates from what are called, and they don't call them, but they are opt-in online convenience samples. And basically how they work is someone puts a sign up on the internet saying, would you like to join our panel? Or you can find sources where you can join 8 or 9 panels at once. The evidence is that, first of all, you're not using random selection. It's self-selection. So nice things like the central limit theorem and law of large numbers don't really apply. But worse, and Pew and others have shown this, you don't know who's joining your panel. And so you get a plethora of fictitious respondents, some of them just outright frauds like click farms and bots, but also others who find out rapidly through networks that if you want to get the meager incentives from participating in the survey or being an Amazon Turk member, you have to do 20 surveys a day, which means you race through them to make something which is less than minimum wage. But they'll have networks telling how you can do this. And I've seen research by showing that in the big opt-in online panels, close to 90% of the responses come from 10% of the panelists who on average belong to 7 other panels and are just doing these things all day long. So bluntly, a lot of it's just junk, but it's extremely inexpensive and it's presented with the patina of, huge efforts are made to say, oh, look, this looked like the election, which is often, not a very good yardstick. I know that I saw a piece in Nature, which was published in the New York Times, showing that a lot of these big data opt-in methods run by Facebook and others, including the US Census, were totally off on the vaccine estimates. Whereas a small 1,000 case sample that was done by a panel, a group, Axios, who was working with Ipsos, who had a thing called the Knowledge Panel, got the results within a few percentage points. It was a probability panel, okay, which is the future, I believe. And that probability panel is created in the States using what's called address-based methodologies. We have a frame of the entire population where everybody has an equal probability of appearing, which is what a probability sample is. It's very expensive, but it's used along with a number of others, like the National Opinion Research Center at University of Chicago has a product that's now being used commercially as well as academically, same idea called Amerispeak. And these are very common in Europe and America and Canada. The only probability panel that I'm aware of, although I hear there's some others being constructed, is our PrePandemic. And how it works is that everybody in that panel has been sampled from a directory which includes every telephone number, both landlines and cell phones, and every single person has been verified with a live interviewer, so we know they're a real person. It costs a lot more. It still costs less than phone surveys. And yeah, just on your question of response rates, when I first started doing this, were about 70%. They're about 5% now. But you know what? If you do it properly, the evidence is that the declining response rates do not affect the estimates, the robustness of parameter estimates. It's just cost more because you have to do more calls. And so nobody does it anymore unless they really need to get the numbers right, which is why stuff like the research on pandemic and public health is being done in the States and in Europe with probability panels. And in fact, that's our clients have been persuaded by that as well. So in the future, I think we'll find that creating a really high quality panel which resembles the entire population and then going to them either online or through phone or mail or other methods, you will continue to be able to get good representative samples with actual real people. That's where I think the future is. You still get good results using telephone banks. It's just it's really expensive and nobody wants to pay for it that way anymore.
Okay.
Most of the stuff you see is joke. Sorry, it's really not very good.
I guess just picking up on this, it's great discussion here. Fantastic presentation, Frank. But I would think that the people who have you shown who have great distrust with kind of public institutions, wouldn't these be the people who would be distrustful of posters like yourself and see you as fake and just kind of hang up or how have you and your colleagues found ways?
Yeah, that's a great question. APOR in the review of the last presidential elections, I think came up with exactly that conclusion, that even though the American pollsters, even the really good ones, they went to great efforts to increase the representation of non-college and other groups, because that had produced about an average 3% miss, which is a big miss nationally. And it was bigger and very much larger in some states. So they made those corrections and they got proper samples of those groups, and they still had about a 3% underestimate of Trump in this election. And on further investigation, it appears what they're doing is underrepresenting institutionally mistrustful. So the same reason that they think they're not going to read fake news, they're not going to talk to a fake pollster. We're specifically targeting that. We find one of the key indicators of institutional mistrustfulness is whether you have this ordered outlook. And so we have been finding ways to oversample those groups and to ensure that we get a significant representation. It backfired a bit on us in the last election because we did get an overrepresentation. We did get a good random representation of institutionally mistrustful with these adjustments. By the way, they're more likely to answer an IVR request, a robocall, than they are a live interview. And they're much more likely than to join a panel, which they won't do. But they will come in with the right incentives to a panel where they are randomly recruited. And the problem in Canada was, so we found that about 10% of the public were voting for the People's Party. But guess what? Unlike the United States, where that same type of voter had a legitimate path to representation, maybe even government, there was no path in Canada because of first past the post. So they ended up either being absorbed by a late campaign by the Conservatives, who targeted them because they were ex-Conservatives, we knew that, telling you're just voting for Trudeau, or they stayed home recognizing that they weren't going to get an MP anyway. So it can be a quandary. That's why I don't think measuring vote intention and comparing it to a vote result is a particularly great indicator of scientific accuracy, because frankly, the population of actual voters is unknown until election day. Whereas we do know the population of all eligible voters, but if the population of actual voters is systematically different, which it often is, if you had it right with the before, you were probably wrong. That's the paradigm, which is why I'm more interested in, do you actually get things like the incidence of people who vaccinated, or the really exciting questions like how many people own their homes and heat it with propane, and questions where if you can get those numbers right, you can be confident that you're getting real representation on the other questions that you're really interested in. Yeah, just one final interesting methodological note. We polled in the United States before the US election, and we used a combination of our IBR, the robocall, plus the live interviewer. The United States precludes calling a cell phone with an automated device. It's an FCC requirement. One of the reasons that we can build our panel in Canada using that, whereas you can't really do it in the States, which is why they use address-based methodology. But there's been, and you'll see this theory of the so-called shy Tory or shy Trump voter. That's the British Polling Council came up with this as an explanation of one of their many misses in the after 2015. In our test, it's absolute nonsense. On the live interviewer, where you would expect a social desirability bias to be more present, the Trump voters were actually more likely to cite their support. So far from being a shy Trump, it was a bold Trump. It was just how do you get them into the sample? But a good example of where a lot of the methodologists talk themselves into just a wrong conclusion. But yeah, polling methodology, I'm hoping we can do a course on that next year, and we can create some really well-equipped, I'm in the late stages of my career, but Carleton University produced a lot of the most successful pollsters in Canada you know, from Ellen Gregg and Angus Reid, Bruce Annis and Daryl Bricker. It'd be great to kind of make that a special, because I think there's actually going to be lots of jobs and interest, and it's a fun career. Working on this stuff is kind of applied social research, and it can be quite exhilarating. So I hope we can refresh that.
I was going to say the course is on the books, Frank, with you. So yeah, we'll be advertising it for sure.
Come and learn the dark arts of polling with Frank. Okay.
Okay, so I think it's almost 9 o'clock, so I think I'll draw things to a close. So I want to, thank Frank Graves for a very engaging talk and for taking the time to answer our questions. And I must admit that I learned a lot this evening, and yeah, maybe I'll take your course to learn a little bit about.
And we'll trade. I'll do yours.
That sounds great. And I think, as a sign of thank you, we should send you a Carleton Socio-Anthropology hoodie so that you're not just wearing your Sprott hoodie as well. So we'll make sure you're well equipped from both Sprott and the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. But yeah, I'd love to give a round of applause to Frank for a very engaging talk this evening.
Thank you very much. If anyone has a follow-up question, get in touch. And I'm just really delighted and proud to be involved with the department, and so happy to talk to you all tonight.
All right. Thank you very much.
Frank. Many thanks, everyone, for great questions.
Thanks.
Discussion.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
All right. Good evening, everyone. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.